Hello, and welcome to our module lesson about terrorism. This week we're going to be looking at almost the opposite of what we looked at in the last module, right? In the last module we focused very heavily on top-down, right, major powers usage of force in the international system. This week we're going to be looking at the other side of that asymmetry, right, the bottom end, right? We're going to be looking at how weaker groups attempt to conduct political change via conflict, and that major methodology is going to be terrorism. So let's go ahead and take a look at our learning objectives for this week. In this module, I have three things I want you to be able to do. First, I want you to be able to distinguish between different types of terrorism. Right? There's a bunch of different ways that terrorism has occurred throughout history, so I want you to be able to see how those different things might fit into different categories. Secondly, I want you to be able to explain why terrorism is such an effective strategy in international conflict. Right? And that helps understand why people would adopt terrorism as their methodology. And finally, I want you to be able to discuss the origins of terrorism. Right? Terrorism has been around for a very long time. This isn't a very recent thing. It's been around for several thousand years. So I want you to be able to discuss how terrorism has evolved, right? Where it came from and how it's evolved throughout history. So what are some of the things that fall underneath the umbrella of this module, right? This terrorism module? Well, first we're going to talk about a definition for terrorism, right? This is a lot more difficult than you would expect it to be to find a functional definition. So we're going to try to get a decent definition going for terrorism. Secondly, we're going to look at what some of these different types of terrorism are. Third, we're going to look at kind of the history of terrorism over the last roughly 2,000 years or so, and how it's changed and evolved, and the meaning of what terrorism has changed. Fourth, we're going to look at the logic of terrorism, right? Why a group would actually pick terrorism, right? What terrorism does. And fifth is we're going to specifically look in why a group might choose terrorism as opposed to something else. Sixth, we're going to look at some of the methodologies of terrorism, right? What are some of the things that terrorists actually do? Seventh, we're going to look at how do we counter terrorism. And finally, we're going to talk about the future potentials for terrorism and counterterrorism. So in defining terrorism, you're going to find that creating a functional definition is actually difficult. In the international community, there actually is not a consensus definition for terrorism, right? The UN does not have a definition for terrorism. Some states actually go about defining terrorism, but right, it's kind of the old notion that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So it's pretty difficult to get a legal functional definition for terrorism. So what we're going to attempt to do instead is find a academic definition for terrorism. Right. So what we're going to work with here is the specific use of terror in a systematic way, especially in the form of coercion. Right. So using terror to inflict psychological damage in order to get people to do what you want them to do. So let's think about what terror actually is. Right. Terror is a really extreme form of fear, right? And it's got panic and dread and fright, right? This is an emotional state that you can be in. And terrorism is using force and the threat of force to induce this psychological state of terror in a population to get them to change their policies, right? Or to do something differently, right? This is essentially psychological warfare against an entire population. So let's try to get an even better, more complete definition going. So for this module, we're going to be building off of a lot of the work that's been done by Bruce Hoffman in his book Inside Terrorism. Right? Bruce Hoffman is really, he's literally the guy that wrote the book on terrorism. He is the biggest and best scholar that we have for terrorism. So we're going to work off of what he has done here. So he defines terrorism as being ineluctably political in aims and motives, right? Terrorism has to be political for Bruce Hoffman. And I think this is a pretty good modern take on terrorism using that. And terrorism has to be violent, or is equally important, threaten to use violence, right? If there's no violence, then there can't really be terror involved. It's designed to specifically have far-reaching psychological repercussions beyond its immediate victim or target, right? So it's not just supposed to hit a target and make them fear. It's supposed to actually affect a much wider spread of people with its actions. It needs to be conducted within an organization or with some sort of identifiable chain of command, or at least a conspiratorial cell structure, right? Lone wolves don't fit in to the way that Hoffman defines terrorism, right? Terrorism needs to be perpetrated by a subnational group or a non-state entity. States themselves cannot be terrorists. And this is actually a change from traditional understandings of terrorism, right? Traditionally speaking, terrorism was a state action, right? States were the ones that were terrorists. They would keep their population in line by using terrorism. And some good examples of this would be Robespierre's France, right? Stalinist Russia, Mao's China, Pinochet's Chile to an extent. But those don't really fit under Hoffman's definition, right? Hoffman's definition deals with the way that terrorism has changed over the last 50 years or so. So that's what we're going to work with, right? Are these really these first 5 points on this slide? Those are going to be our definition for terrorism. So what are some types of terrorism? What does terrorism look like in practice? Well, what we have here are about 10 different, right, we've got 9 or 10 different types of terrorism on this page. So I'm going to give you a brief definition for each type of terrorism and a couple of examples. So the first group, right, the first type here is domestic terrorism, which occurs within the borders of a country and is usually carried out by some sort of extremist group. So some good examples for this from the United States are the KKK in the early parts of the 1900s and really through today, and Timothy McVeigh and his extreme right-wing nationalist group in their bombing of the Oklahoma City federal building. Right, these are extremist groups operating within the borders of a country, trying to affect some sort of change within the country itself. Second, we've got nationalist terrorism, and this is one of the major terrorist types, right, one of the most important terrorist types that we're going to come across. This is usually associated with the struggle for independence or autonomy from some sort of colonizer. Good examples for this are Chechnyan terrorist groups, the IRA, and some early actions in Vietnam and Tunisia in the 1950s. Our third type is religious terrorism. Right, this is violence that has been divinely ordained. Right, this is groups that think they're in a struggle on the side of God. Right, this is normally where we would lump Islamic terrorism, although there's a lot more complication that goes in with that, and we'll talk about that more this week. Also, the Thuggis. Right, there was a group, there was a cult of Kali, which is the god of death in Hinduism. They would go around murdering travelers on the side of their god. Now, they didn't have a political aim, but what they were doing was clearly terrorist in intent. State terrorism is cold and calculated violence carried out to keep a population in line. Right, the state itself is the one perpetrating the terrorism in this example. So this would be like Stalin's purges, Pinochet's Chile. Possibly ISIS. ISIS is an interesting case that we'll talk about a little bit more later on. They don't necessarily fit very well into any of these categories. Global terrorism is really more of a methodology than a particular ideology. It's using the various different ideas of terrorism, but trying to apply it on a global basis. So a group like Al-Qaeda, which is somewhere between a nationalist terrorist group and a religious terrorist group, is conducting its operations not within its own borders, but on a global scale, attempting to have global reach with its actions. And ISIS kind of fits into this as well. Eco-terrorism is terrorism in defense of the environment, right? So the Earth Liberation Front, the Earth Liberation Army, right? These groups that would go around destroying SUV lots and doing like corporate sabotage in the name of the environment. All right, that's eco-terrorism. Narco-terrorism is terrorism that's associated with drug trafficking. Right, we see this a lot along the U.S.-Mexican border, in Mexico, widely speaking. We've seen it in Colombia as well. Right, this is really just terrorism that goes along with supporting drug trafficking. There's neo-Luddite terrorism, which are people who carry out terrorism to stop technological progress. And I think this is going to be kind of a growing group over the next several decades. We've already witnessed this pretty heavily. The Unabomber throughout the 70s and 80s and the early 90s was a big example of this kind of neo-Luddist terrorism. And the final type of terrorism we're going to talk about in this module, but is by no means the end of the line for all types of terrorism is cyber terrorism, which is attacking infrastructure using technological means. So we see this with hacking, anonymous, the Russian hacking of a lot of Western elections could possibly be cyber terrorism, but that remains to be seen, right? So the line where the line is drawn with cyber terrorism is a little bit more difficult to understand, but it's definitely a type of methodology of terrorism that we need to talk about. So let's briefly look at a history of terrorism over the last really 2,000 years, right? The first group that we could really call terrorists would be the Sicarii Zealots that emerged during the first century, right? These Sicarii Zealots were a Israeli Jewish group operating under Roman occupation, attempting to kick out the Romans. They would go around and assassinate and kill Roman citizens. The Maccabees would have been considered part of the Sicarii Zealots. Judas Iscariot was a zealot. There was another zealot that was a disciple of Jesus, one of the 12 disciples. So there were two of them that were zealots, which is also interesting considering there's also a Roman tax collector who was a Roman citizen in there, right? There's a whole religious thing we could get into there that let's just pass on. But right, the Sicarii Zealots really used this assassination of Roman citizens in an attempt to free themselves from Roman rule. Now this backfired on them. The Roman army came in and descended and destroyed the temple, and it was a whole deal. But right, these terrorist techniques have been around for a long time. Fast forward about a millennia, about 1,000 years, and we see the Al-Hashashin, right, the assassins, emerge in the 11th century, going around and murdering both Islamic leaders and crusaders, attempting to carve out a political sphere for themselves, right? Attempting to actually gain lands and hold lands for themselves. Fast forward another 600-700 years, and we get to our first real example that redefined terrorism for us. The Reign of Terror of Robespierre, right? That he would go around actually conducting state terrorism to defend his revolution. Another century or so on, we get at the end of the 1800s, we get the Boer War, where we see the emergence of a lot of modern terrorist tactics and a lot of modern counter-terrorist tactics between the British and the Boers in South Africa. Right, and really the 20th century and the early 21st century have seen rapid evolution and realignment of what terrorism is. Right, by 1911, you see anarchist, separatist, nationalist groups like the Black Hand actually beginning, right, doing assassinations and bombings, causing World War I to occur. Throughout World War II, we see the resistance do a lot of terrorist tactics and techniques against the Nazis. And then after the war, we see kind of the beginnings of what we really think of as terrorism, right? This nationalist, separatist terrorism throughout many colonial holdings, right? So Algeria, Tunisia, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and that's where, in Sri Lanka is actually where suicide terrorism began. We see political ideology terrorism in the 1970s. The Red Brigades, who want to do forward communism in Germany, began to operate very heavily. We also see Islamic terrorists begin really becoming the main type of terrorism that we see. Right over on the right-hand side is basically the evolution of Islamic terrorism since the 1970s. Right, the real coming out party was in 1972 at the Munich Olympic Games, and throughout the 70s and 80s there were various hijackings of airlines. By the end of the 1980s, they had transitioned away from just stealing plane flights to blowing them up instead, right, with the Lockerbie bombing. Attacks against embassies in Africa through the 2000s, the 90s and 2000s, bombing of the U.S. coal. In the year 2000, we saw Chechen Islamic terrorists take over a school. The response to that by Vladimir Putin was really his emergence on the world scene. Then, of course, we have 9/11, 2001, which was the big one, not 9/1. 9/11 is what that's supposed to be. And then it's according attacks, right? The Madrid train bombing in 2003, the 7/7 and 7/14 bombings, the emergence of the civil war in Iraq, the insurgency in Afghanistan, All of this kind of builds up to the emergence of ISIS in 2002. That's really become kind of our major threat of terrorism up to today. So terrorism has evolved a lot over the last 1,000 years, going from really small religious groups conducting assassinations through large state terrorism to, again, back to separatist groups. And some, with ISIS essentially a separatist group attempting to establish its own state and still using global terrorism means. Terrorism has undergone a lot of change in the past 2,000 years. So why would a group choose to adopt terrorism as its methodology? Well, the main reason here is that terrorism is a really good way for an inferior force to attempt to defeat some sort of superior force. Now, terrorism, usually, in our minds, we think, well, why are they terrorists? We like to think that it's because they hate us because we're free, we're Christian, whatever. That's not the case. Generally speaking, the reason why terrorism is adopted is for a very direct political purpose. So imagine that you're a pretty poor organization, you don't have a very large support base helping you out, but you want to affect some sort of change, How do you overcome the daunting odds of being essentially a massively underfunded, undersupported group attempting to make some sort of change? Well, you have to learn to fight from a position of weakness, and use the force of the enemy to your own advantage. So terrorism is essentially the military version of jiu-jitsu, where you're using the strength and power of your opponent against themselves. You're attempting to turn their own force back against them. So how do you do this, What is the methodology involved here? Well, really it comes back to inflicting costs, specifically inflicting costs on your target. And this is more than just a physical audience cost or cost to an infrastructure. You're also inflicting psychological costs, Think about the world that we live in today, If you want to go fly on an airplane, you have to go through massive amounts of security, This is daunting on you. We as a civilization, we as a society here in the West spend a lot of time thinking about how to counter terrorism. And this takes up, economic costs. It costs our democracy, It really inflicts a whole lot of costs beyond just damages inflicted by the attacks themselves. And that's what's really useful about terrorism. That's why it's such a powerful tool, such an attractive tool. Is it allows you to inflict heavy costs on your enemy beyond just the direct military costs, the direct cost to conduct an attack. And now that we live in an era of very widespread media, we can use terrorism can use the media itself to amplify its reach, amplify its goals, inflict even further costs beyond what they've been able to do even back in the 70s. And particularly suicide terrorism is a very powerful methodology to use as well. Robert Pape has done a lot of work thinking about the strategic logic of suicide terrorism. And what he's found is that suicide terrorism is actually a very rational decision to make. If you recruit people who don't see that they have much of a future for themselves, then they would be willing to conduct these suicide terrorist attacks in order to help those around them. There can be direct payment for the survivors from suicide terrorist attacks, or they could the need to inflict damage on those who have hurt you can really drive someone into using suicide terrorism. Often those that are suicide terrorists have lost someone to a foreign occupier. Surprisingly, it's not young jobless youths that do this. It's usually well-educated middle-aged people that have perhaps lost a child or a brother or a sister, family, to some sort of foreign occupier that really adopt suicide terrorism as a methodology. So let's look at some of the systemic causes of terrorism. Perhaps the biggest cause of terrorism is poverty, but it's not absolute poverty, It's actually relative poverty. If you look over on the left, this big image I've got here is something that we in political science call the J curve. where we see expected, right, satisfaction, right, where we think we're going. If you look at the dotted line, where we think we're going is pretty good. It keeps going up and up and up, and our actual need satisfaction is kind of tracking with it. Now, where things get dangerous is when the gap begins to diverge, right? If we actually end up in a worse place than we were, or we're way far away from where we think we will be, that's when you're most likely to see some sort of revolutionary action or terrorism occur. And this especially is exacerbated by foreign occupation. Between poverty and foreign occupation, that explains the vast majority of terrorist activity. And this usually is exacerbated even further by the forces of globalization. Right? People feeling lost in their own country and doing far worse than they thought they would be doing creates a lot of problems and pushes terrorism along. Some other things that actually go into this is legitimate grievance against government, right? Sometimes you actually have cause to want to attack the government, or if you've been humiliated by past actions, right? That ties in with grievance to government. In states where there's a lack of democracy and human rights, we see that terrorism is more likely, and terrorism is extremely likely in what we call failed states, right? States that are no longer able to actually administer themselves. And oftentimes we see terrorism as a consequence of other actions, right? This is called blowback, right? The main example for this, right, is the story of Charlie Wilson's war, right? The U.S. involvement in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviet Union, right? We trained up a very powerful force to fight against the Soviet Union called the Mujahideen. We armed them. We taught them how to fight. We sent our special forces in to train them. And then after the Soviets were defeated, we essentially abandoned Afghanistan. We didn't help rebuild it, and we left it with this very powerful paramilitary force that was eventually able to turn and fight against the United States. The Mujahideen basically ends up becoming Al-Qaeda and creating a lot of problems later on for the United States, right? This is an unintended consequence of our actions, right? This is called blowback. And this is a fairly important idea that you'll need to grasp to think about why terrorism occurs. So let's talk a little bit about how terrorists actually operate and how they recruit their operators as well. So terrorism really terrorists want to go and create a climate of fear and build popular support for themselves, right? They want to create a climate of fear that's going to cause the opponent to overreact, right? And strike at a larger part of the population, and to get that population to turn and be sympathetic to the terrorist cause. So the way they operate and create this climate of fear is through calculated attacks, right? They can either do this directly through a operational chain of command, or they can build up a no-leader virtual network cell structure, right? That cell structure is what we kind of think of about terrorists these days, where there's different groups operating independently from each other, but are coordinated through some sort of virtual network. Some terrorist groups actually attempt to reject the terrorist label to gain legitimacy. The main place where we see this is Hezbollah, who actually functions and provides services like a government in Lebanon and Palestine, right? They attempt to give jobs, clean up the streets, basically operate as the government itself to gain recruits, right? But their military wing still operates like a terrorist organization. So what kinds of things do terrorist groups do? Well, the last three things we see down here: selective kidnappings, right, and killings, right? Stealing people from the population and possibly killing them in a very directed sort of way is one way to instill fear. Probably the most popular one these days is random killings, right? Target a area, but don't really necessarily target who you're killing. Right, assassination is still something that terrorist organizations attempt to do, but there's been a lot of transition recently towards this random killing. Right, when we think of terrorist operations, they'll pick a target, but then they don't really care necessarily who they kill. And predominantly terrorist organizations use conventional weapons, right? There's been some talk of terrorist organizations using weapons of mass destruction, but we still haven't really witnessed that, aside from a few small examples. Generally speaking, terrorists use bombs or non-conventional things that could turn into destructive devices like airplanes, trains, cars, the like. But really the most effective weapon for terrorist organizations recently has been the AK-47, right? It's cheap, it's efficient, it's effective. So what we see is that, right, terrorists have these ways that they operate, but how do they go about getting people to do these operations? So on the right hand side, we've got kind of a chain here talking about how you go about recruiting people into becoming terrorists. So organizations like Hezbollah and the PLO, as we already mentioned, attempt to come at this almost like a government, right? They provide services for their citizens, and this helps them recruit people to their side, in much the same way that our own government seeks to recruit people for the military, right? You have loyalty to this group and you want to help them, so you sign up and you join in and you go and become a terrorist, much the same way that in the United States you want to help your country, you go into a recruiting office, right? The Hezbollah and PLO have recruiting offices. You walk in, right, you get a signing bonus and all of this stuff. It's a very standard recruitment way. But a lot of other terrorist organizations have to go about this a different way, right? They don't have necessarily a stricter structure like the madrasas to operate in, right? Where you can go and directly pick students from these religious schools who seem isolated and try to escalate them into becoming a terrorist. So we see organizations that aren't necessarily terrorist organizations, but might be terrorist affiliated. And we see terrorist groups come in and infiltrate and try to take the most radical members, or the most separated, right, the most isolated members of these groups, and you peel them off and you try to escalate them, right, by showing them this new ideology, right, a new political ideology that might be a bit more radical than what they had originally been dealing with, and eventually you slowly escalate them into becoming a terrorist, right? You slowly introduce them to newer and more radical ideas over time, to where it's not just, hey, do you want to be a terrorist? It's, hey, we have this one grievance, why don't we come and talk about it, right? And what can we do about it? And then next thing you know, you're training out in the woods or the desert and thinking about how you're going to blow up, right, civilian bases. So, right, it's not just necessarily a blank statement, right? Do you want to be a terrorist, right? This could be a way to slowly escalate people into becoming a terrorist. So we have our people, but we need money in order to carry out these activities, right? While AK-47s and C4 might be cheap, you still have to have some money to operate with, and probably more money than the individuals can provide for themselves. Now, so how do you go about funding your terrorist organization? Well, sometimes just getting payment from individuals is a good way to do it, right? Maybe send out a recruiter to a bar somewhere and say, hey, let's talk about the struggle and all this, and gets individual donations, right? That's one way this happens. We also see money passed along informal lines. The predominant way this is done is through a network called the Hawala, which is what we have the illustration here for. So, the way this works, and this can be a legitimate way to transfer money as well, but because it's so informal and paperless, this becomes very difficult, right, to track. So the guy with the US dollars goes to his Hawala dealer and says he wants to send money to the guy who needs euros on the other side. So the US guy gives money to his Hawala guy, who calls up the other Hawala guy who's going to give euros to the other party that needed to receive money. And eventually the Hawala guys are going to help settle their accounts every month, every quarter, every year, something like that, just to make sure the payments are paid out right. This is a very trust-based system. So this Hawala has become a very major way that terrorist organizations go about funding themselves. And it's not just Islamic terrorists that use this. The IRA used a very similar process. Other groups have used very similar ways of raising money and transferring money as well. But that's not the only way that you fund terrorism, right? It's not all just individual payments. Sometimes states can actually finance terrorism, right? Muammar Gaddafi in Libya helped finance a large bit of Islamic terrorism through the 80s and 90s. Sometimes terrorist groups can actually control vital resources. ISIS has taken over oil fields, right? And they control the flow of oil, and this has really helped fund their operations. Then, of course, there's just plain criminal activity. Al-Qaeda had been known to play very heavily in the drug trade. Early Soviet terrorists would actually just go and rob banks and take that money and turn it into their terrorist activities. So funding sources vary pretty wildly. Sometimes they're legitimate sources, other times they're not. So this really complicates cutting down on the funding streams for terrorist activities, because oftentimes these are very informal ways that they're getting funded. So about that, right? How do you counter terrorism? Well, traditionally, right, in the pre-9/11 era, terrorism was treated as a criminal issue. Groups like Interpol and the FBI would have jurisdiction. They'd go work the case and attempt to make arrests, right, and actually arrest terrorists and try them. Intelligence organizations would get involved, right, pass along information to law enforcement, but mostly this was a law enforcement issue. But in the post-9/11 world, once 9/11 occurred, terrorism was shifted to being treated as a military attack, right? And this became a military issue. So the military would actually go and invade countries and carry out special operations in an attempt to capture and kill terrorists. So now we've switched from law enforcement being the primary actor to the military being the primary actor. But the intelligence organizations still have a very big role to play in directing operations. This methodology for fighting terrorism has had mixed reviews, right? We've become bogged down in two very long conflicts that have created even bigger conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. So maybe we should look at some other ways that we could counter terrorism. One thing that's been suggested, particularly by Robert Pape, is this idea of offshore balancing, right? Instead of sending all of our troops onto land, right, and invading a country, we would keep them out of the country and send them in to conduct attacks and strikes as necessary, right? What this would do is prevent our troops from being in harm's way for too long, and prevent our troops from really just giving another target for terrorists to attack. This isn't fully adopted, but we have seen a large push in this direction with the introduction of drone strikes and drone warfare in fighting terrorism, right? Instead of putting any boots on the ground at all, right? We just conduct attacks and intelligence gathering with drones. So this has been rather successful in a switch, even though it's still military related. It's a different way of conducting it that doesn't present new targets of opportunity to the terrorists. There's also this notion of giving letters of marque and reprisal, right, to private actors to go and fight terrorists. This is very much related to the way that we fought pirates in the 17 and 1800s, right? We would give letters of marque and reprisal to what we called privateers at the time. I guess today they would be private military contractors, basically saying they're working on under the discretion of a state government, and they are allowed to go and hunt down these terrorists. And right when they get them, we would give them a bounty. Right? That's the way that we fought pirates. Perhaps that'd be an interesting way to fight terrorists that would really reduce the costs for the state itself. But what we've seen perhaps be the most effective alternative strategy is operational development and counterinsurgency. This has become the more official way of fighting terrorism now. We've redeveloped the way that our military operates. Right, terrorists are able to quickly change the way that they operate and change their tactics. And traditional militaries aren't very good at doing that. They aren't very good at adapting. So one of the things that we've done over the past 10 years, the past decade or so, is we've changed our military to be able to change its operations very quickly, right? To be able to adapt to changes. So this new approach, right? This new military approach involving drone offshore balancing via drone warfare and changes in operational tempo to where we can actually out-adapt the terrorist organizations has made counterterrorism actions much more successful than they were in the early days of this war on terror. But that's not to say the terrorists themselves do not adapt, right? So what does the future of terrorism look like? Well, first and foremost, cyber terrorism is probably going to come way into the forefront, right? Using computers and the internet to actually wage terrorist activities themselves, right? One, you could use cyber attacks in order to gain money for the terrorist group, right? This is a new revenue stream for terrorism. But even more importantly, you could use cyber attacks to attack physical infrastructure, shutting down water treatment plants, electricity, power generation, right? Really attacking national infrastructures at a cyber level. Right? You could even use this to theoretically shut down a power grid in an entire country. Now, one of the problems with this, right, one of the problems faced by us in attempting to counter cyber terrorism is that there's no national off switch for the internet. We have become so reliant on the internet that it's very difficult to shut down the internet, right? We really can't do it, right? The internet is very decentralized and there's no national authority that could, right, just shut it down to stop an attack. We rely on it too much to have to shut it down. So what this does is it shifts the onus of anti-cyber terrorism onto private companies, right? Private actors and internet technology professionals, right? We're all responsible for fighting cyber terrorism by using good, secure practices on the way we operate on the internet and online. Now, that's not to say that we haven't attempted to create cyber units, right? The Air Force and the Army have both created them. The NSA is doing a lot of work in fighting terrorism and fighting cyber crime by generally hiring hackers to work for us instead of against us. But really what this boils down to is the fact that because the internet is so distributed in the way that it's set up, it's really each and every one of our responsibility. It's at the individual level to protect against cyber terrorism. So this future of electronic terrorism, it's a little scary right now, but each and every one of us, through proper usage of digital technologies and information technologies, can actually help fight terrorism every day. So what are your next steps? Well, you need to go and do your readings from Essential Readings in World Politics. You need to complete Module 7 quiz, complete Module 7 assignment, and then Module 8 is a bit different than what we've done so far. For Module 8, there's no lecture video, and there's no readings from Essential Readings in World Politics or from Essentials of International Relations. Instead, what you have to do is read Old Man's War. Right? This is a book by John Scalzi. It's a novel. It's a very good novel. It's one of my favorites. The reason why you need to read this is because it actually has a lot to say about the international system. Right? Module 8 assignment has to do with, right, this book and the things we've learned so far in this class. So you're going to be doing something a little bit different from Module 8. Once you complete Module 8, then you can go on and take your midterm. So I highly recommend going back and looking over your previous quizzes and module assignments, as well as the notes that you've taken as you go in to take this midterm. So if you have any questions, please submit them to the forum. I'll get to them as soon as I possibly can. Otherwise, go ahead and start reading in on Old Man's War. It shouldn't take you too long. It's only like 300 pages. It's double spaced, and it's a really fun novel. Right? It moves pretty fast. You'll have trouble putting it down. I know I did. So go ahead and start doing that. And I guess at this point, I'll see you after the midterm. So good luck on all of that, and have a nice day.